Some people are born to wear diamonds, others are born to clean them. And Bliss Morgan had been scrubbing other people's treasures for so long she'd forgotten what her own dreams looked like. The crystal chandelier above her head cast rainbow fragments across the marble floor, each shard of light worth more than her father's life. She pressed her cloth harder against the pristine white stone, her knees aching against the cold surface as she worked. The Michaels mansion stretched around her like a glittering mausoleum, 40 rooms of perfection that she maintained but could never truly possess, filled with treasures that mocked her poverty with their silent beauty. Her reflection wavered in the polished marble, distorted and broken, much like her hope had become over the past 6 months. Every morning she woke in the cramped servants' quarters. Every evening she counted the meager dollars in her pay envelope, and every night she fell asleep to the sound of her father's labored breathing echoing in her memory. "Bliss, honey, you're going to scrub a hole right through to China if you keep going like that." Dorothy Fairmont's weathered voice cut through her reverie. The headmaid's eyes held the kind of bone-deep sadness that came from watching too many young women break against the walls of this golden prison. Bliss looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the chandelier's light like trapped stars. At 23 years old, she already felt ancient, worn down by circumstances beyond her control. "I'm fine, Miss Dorothy. Just thinking." "Thinking about your daddy again?" Dorothy glanced around nervously before kneeling beside the younger woman, her old joints protesting. "Child, you can't carry the weight of the world on those shoulders. Some burdens are too heavy, even for hearts as strong as yours." The weight, always the weight. It pressed down on her chest every waking moment, the knowledge that Augustus Morgan lay dying in a sterile hospital room across town, his lungs failing him breath by breath, while she polished silver that would never save him. The experimental treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering offered hope, but at a price that might as well have been the moon. $40,000, Bliss whispered, her voice barely audible above the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. $40,000 for a chance. Just a chance. Dorothy's weathered hand found hers, calloused fingers wrapping around younger ones with surprising warmth. "I know, sweetheart. Lord knows I've been praying every night. Prayer doesn't pay for miracles, Miss Dorothy." The bitterness in Bliss's voice surprised them both. She'd been raised in the church, taught to believe in hope and the power of faith. But faith didn't pay for experimental treatments, and minimum wage was just another form of dying slowly. The sharp staccato of heels against marble echoed through the vast foyer, precise as a metronome counting down to judgment. Both women tensed immediately. There was only one person in the mansion whose footsteps commanded that kind of instant fear. Patricia Blackstone Michaels materialized in the doorway like a vision from a beautiful nightmare. At 65, she was still devastatingly elegant in the way that only unlimited wealth could maintain. Her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon, her designer suit hugging a figure that personal trainers and cosmetic surgeons had preserved like a priceless work of art. But her eyes were winter grey, cold and calculating as a predator sizing up prey. "Dorothy, please check on the arrangements for tonight's dinner party." Her voice was silk, wrapped around steel, each word carefully modulated to command immediate obedience. "The Ashworth merger is crucial to our fourth-quarter projections." "Yes, ma'am." Dorothy squeezed Bliss's hand once before struggling to her feet, her old knees protesting audibly. As she walked away, she cast one last worried glance over her shoulder, a look that sent ice water through Bliss's veins. Now they were alone, the queen and the servant girl, facing each other across an ocean of marble and money. Patricia's gaze swept over Bliss with the practiced eye of someone who saw people as assets to be evaluated and exploited. The scrutiny made Bliss's skin crawl, but she kept her head high. Dignity was the one thing money couldn't buy or steal. "Tell me about your father," Patricia said suddenly, settling onto the velvet bench near the window, with the fluid grace of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world. Bliss's hands stilled on the cloth. "Ma'am." "Your father, Augustus Morgan, lung cancer stage 4. The experimental treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering, $40,000. Patricia's voice was conversational, as if she were discussing the weather or the stock market. "I make it my business to know about my employees' personal situations." The words hit Bliss like physical blows. She'd been so careful, so private about her family's struggles. The knowledge that this woman, this cold, calculating woman, had been watching, investigating, cataloguing her pain, felt like a violation of the deepest kind. "I don't understand," Bliss managed, her voice barely steady. Patricia smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Oh, but you do. You're a bright girl, Bliss. You understand perfectly well that I don't do anything without a purpose." She stood, moving closer with the predatory grace of a shark circling wounded prey. "Your father is dying. You're desperate. And I have something that could save him." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Bliss felt her heartbeat in her throat, her palms slick with sweat against the cleaning cloth. "What do you want?" Such a direct question. I appreciate that. Patricia's smile widened. "I want you to spend one night with my son." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Bliss stared at her, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "One night. With Richard, my son." Patricia's voice remained perfectly calm, as if she were discussing dinner plans. "You see, dear, our family has certain traditions, bloodline preservation, legacy continuation. Richard has been resistant to his duties in that regard." Nausea rose in Bliss's throat. "You're asking me to—" "I'm offering you a solution." Patricia's interruption was sharp as a blade. $40,000, cash, tonight, in exchange for one evening of your time." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, each bell toll echoing in the sudden silence. Bliss felt as if she were drowning in crystal-clear water, unable to breathe, but able to see everything with terrible clarity. This woman, this monster in designer clothes, was asking her to sell herself for her father's life. "I can't," Bliss whispered, the words torn from her throat. "Can't you?" Patricia tilted her head, studying Bliss with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. "Your father has perhaps 2 weeks left without treatment. The waiting list for financial assistance is 6 months long. Your salary would take you 20 years to save enough, assuming you never spent a penny on food or shelter." Each word was a precisely placed dagger, finding every vulnerable spot in Bliss's armor. The terrible mathematics of poverty laid bare with surgical precision. "Why me?" The question escaped before Bliss could stop it. Patricia's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Because you're beautiful. Because you're desperate. Because you're nobody special enough to cause complications later." She paused, letting the cruelty sink in. "And because I can see in your eyes that you're already considering it." The truth hit Bliss like a physical blow because it was true. In the darkest corner of her mind, she was already calculating. One night. One terrible night against her father's life. Against the chance to hear his laugh again, to feel his arms around her, to have more time with the man who had raised her alone after her mother's death. "I need to think," Bliss said, her voice hollow. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Patricia glanced at the Cartier watch on her wrist. "You have until 8 o'clock tonight. The money will be waiting regardless of your decision, but the offer expires at midnight." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Bliss? The other staff members need not know about our conversation. I trust you understand the importance of discretion." The threat was velvet-wrapped but unmistakable. Bliss nodded mutely, watching as Patricia glided away, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown to damnation. Alone in the vast foyer, surrounded by crystal and gold and the oppressive weight of impossible choices, Bliss Morgan pressed her face against the cold marble floor and wept for the girl she used to be, the one who still believed that some things were too precious to sell. Chapter 2. The Devil's Bargain. The devil, Bliss discovered, wore $1,000 suit and had eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. Richard Michaels stood in the doorway of his private study, whiskey glass in hand, looking every inch the reluctant prince of an empire built on other people's broken dreams. At 38, he possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that graced magazine covers and broke hearts, sharp cheekbones, dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead, and those piercing grey eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. But it was the pain in those eyes that undid her. "So you're the sacrifice my mother chose," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that money couldn't cure. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times. 9 o'clock. 1 hour past Patricia's deadline, and here Bliss stood in a borrowed black dress that Dorothy had pressed into her trembling hands, her hair swept up in a style that made her look older, more sophisticated than her 23 years. The makeup Dorothy had carefully applied couldn't hide the haunted look in her eyes, the pallor of someone who had sold a piece of her soul. "I'm not a sacrifice," Bliss said quietly, stepping into the room lined with leather-bound books and the ghosts of better men. "I'm a woman trying to save her father's life." Rick's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. "And I'm a man whose mother thinks she can buy him a bride like she bought everything else in this godforsaken mausoleum." He drained his whiskey in one burning gulp. "Tell me, Bliss. Yes, I know your name. How much did she offer you?" The question hung between them like a blade. Bliss lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. $40,000. 40,000. He set down his glass with deliberate care. The price of a luxury car. The cost of a weekend in Monaco. The exact amount needed to save Augustus Morgan's life. His smile was sharp as broken glass. "My mother is nothing if not thorough in her research. You know about my father. I know about everyone who works in this house. I know that you've been here for 3 years, that you send every spare penny to your father's medical bills, that you haven't bought yourself a new dress in 18 months. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and dark that made her think of midnight and dangerous promises. "I know that you're terrified right now, but you're here anyway because love makes us do impossible things." The unexpected gentleness in his voice nearly broke her. She'd expected cold calculation, entitled arrogance. Instead, she found a man who looked as trapped as she felt. "Your mother said it was about bloodline preservation," Bliss said, hating how small her voice sounded. "My mother says a lot of things." Rick moved to the window, staring out at the manicured gardens where night-blooming jasmine filled the air with its heavy perfume. "She's been trying to marry me off to suitable society daughters for 15 years. When that failed, she decided to take matters into her own hands." "And you agreed to this?" He turned back to her, and the raw pain in his expression made her breath catch. "I agreed to nothing. But Patricia Blackstone Michaels doesn't accept no for an answer. She destroys what she can't control, and she threatened to destroy you if I didn't comply." The words hit her like ice water. "What do you mean? Your job? Your father's medical insurance? Your apartment lease? The small loan your friend Bailey co-signed for you last year?" His voice was hollow. "She owns pieces of everything that matters to you, Bliss. She could take it all away with a phone call." The room spun around her. Bliss sank into the leather chair by the fireplace, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. So we're both prisoners. The only difference is that my cage is made of gold. Rick poured himself another drink, his hands steady despite the tremor in his voice. But yes, we're both prisoners. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their circumstances settling between them like a living thing. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with books that told stories of heroes and villains, of love and loss, of people who had choices. These two did not. "I need you to know something," Rick said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't what I want. Not like this. Not with you having no choice." Bliss looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the expensive suit and inherited wealth to the man beneath. A man who had been shaped by the same woman who had just offered her $40,000 to sell herself. A man who had learned to survive in a world where love was a weakness and compassion was a luxury. "But it's what's going to happen," she said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes." The word fell between them like a stone into still water. "Unless you walk away, right now. I'll tell her you refused, that I couldn't go through with it. I'll find another way to protect you from her retaliation. And my father." Rick's silence was answer enough. Bliss closed her eyes, thinking of Augustus Morgan lying in that sterile hospital bed, his breathing growing weaker each day. She thought of his laugh, the way his eyes lit up when she visited, the stories he told about her mother. She thought of the promises she'd made to never let him die alone, to fight for him with everything she had. "If we do this," she said, opening her eyes to meet his tortured gaze, "I have conditions." Something flickered in his expression, respect maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Name them." "Afterwards, I disappear. No contact, no complications. Your mother gets what she wants, the possibility of an heir, and I get the money to save my father. Clean break. And if there's a child?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Bliss had thought about this, had spent the last 2 hours walking through the mansion gardens, weighing possibilities against the certainty of her father's death. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," she said finally. "But tonight, this is about survival. Nothing more." Rick nodded slowly. "All right, but I have a condition too." "What?" "No matter what happens, remember that I didn't want it to be this way. Remember that if I could have chosen, I would have chosen you freely, without money or threats or my mother's manipulation." His voice broke slightly. "I would have chosen you because of who you are, not because of what you can give me." The words hit her like a physical blow. In another life, another world, she might have believed him. She might have let herself fall for this damaged, beautiful man who looked at her like she was something precious rather than something bought. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "I'm sorry." He stood, moving to the door. "I'll give you a few minutes to prepare yourself. There's a bathroom through that door if you need it." He paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorknob. "Bliss?" "Yes?" "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For all of it." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the ghosts and the books and the impossible weight of what was about to happen. Bliss sat in the leather chair, staring at the fire, thinking about the girl she had been this morning. The one who still believed that some things were too precious to sell, that dignity was worth more than money, that love could only exist in freedom. That girl was gone now, sacrificed on the altar of desperate love for a dying father. What remained was a woman who would do anything to save the man who had raised her, who had taught her that sometimes the greatest courage was found in the smallest acts of love, even if it meant selling herself to the devil in $1,000 suit, even if it meant breaking her own heart in the process. The fire crackled in the hearth, and Bliss Morgan prepared to become someone else entirely. Chapter 3. Cast into the storm. Lightning doesn't ask permission before it strikes, and neither did the fury in Patricia Blackstone Michael's eyes when Bliss handed her the pregnancy test 3 weeks later. Negative. The word fell from Patricia's lips like a curse, her manicured fingers crushing the paper that held Bliss's carefully orchestrated lie. The morning sun, streaming through the mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, caught the silver threads in her hair. But there was nothing radiant about her now, only cold, calculating rage. Bliss stood in the center of the opulent sitting room, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. The test results, Dr. Hadrian Westbrook had provided were perfect forgeries, identical to the real thing except for the most crucial detail. The doctor had been surprisingly sympathetic when she'd approached him with her desperate plan, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone else trapped by the Michaels family's machinations. "You're certain?" Patricia's voice was silk wrapped around steel, each word precisely calibrated to cut. "Yes, ma'am." Bliss kept her voice steady, though inside she felt like she was drowning. "I'm not pregnant." The silence stretched between them like a wire about to snap. Patricia moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass as she stared out at the gardens where Bliss had made her devil's bargain 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks since she'd spent a night in Rick's arms that had been tender and passionate and everything she'd never expected, a night that had created the very life she was now denying. "Disappointing," Patricia said finally, her voice hollow as a tomb. "Deeply disappointing. I'm sorry." The words tasted like ash in Bliss's mouth, but she forced them out. "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Patricia turned from the window, and the look in her eyes made Bliss's blood run cold. "What I wanted, my dear, was an heir. What I got was a barren disappointment who couldn't even manage to do the one thing women are biologically designed for." Each word was a precisely placed dagger, finding every vulnerable spot in Bliss's armor. She'd known this would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the venom, the casual cruelty with which Patricia dismissed her humanity. "I fulfilled my part of the bargain," Bliss said, lifting her chin with a dignity that felt like armor. "You said 1 night. I gave you 1 night, and failed spectacularly." Patricia's smile was sharp as winter wind. "Tell me, Bliss, what exactly did you think would happen after this moment? Did you imagine you'd simply return to your life of scrubbing floors and emptying wastebaskets? Did you think I'd keep you on staff after this disappointment?" The words hit Bliss like physical blows. She'd been so focused on protecting her unborn children that she hadn't fully considered the aftermath. Of course, Patricia wouldn't keep her on. Of course, there would be consequences beyond just the pregnancy results. You assumed wrong." Patricia moved closer, her presence filling the room like toxic smoke. "I don't keep failures in my employ. I don't tolerate incompetence. And I certainly don't harbor reminders of my own poor judgment." The door to the sitting room opened, and Rick stepped inside, his face haggard from 3 weeks of sleepless nights and mounting guilt. He'd tried to approach Bliss multiple times since that night, but she'd avoided him with the skill of someone who knew that looking back would turn her to salt. "Mother, I heard voices." He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Bliss standing in the center of the room like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "What's going on?" "Your little experiment has failed," Patricia said, waving the pregnancy test like evidence at a trial. "She's not pregnant. 3 weeks of my time, $40,000, and nothing to show for it." Something flickered in Rick's expression. Relief, maybe, or disappointment. Bliss couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the protective step he took toward her. the way his shoulders squared as if preparing for battle. "That's not her fault," he said quietly. "These things don't always—" "Don't!" Patricia's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare defend her. This was your responsibility, Richard, your duty, and you failed as spectacularly as she did." "My duty?" Rick's voice rose, 3 weeks of suppressed rage finally finding its target. "My duty was to be a stud horse for your breeding program. My duty was to force myself on a woman who had no choice. Your duty was to continue our bloodline." Patricia's composure cracked, revealing the fanatic beneath the elegant facade. "To ensure that everything I've built, everything our family has accomplished, doesn't die with you. Maybe it should die with me." The words exploded from Rick like a dam bursting. Maybe this whole goddamn empire should crumble rather than be built on the backs of people like her. He gestured toward Bliss, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart clench. Not just attraction or guilt, but something deeper, something that looked dangerously like love. "Enough." Patricia's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "This conversation is over. Bliss, you have 1 hour to pack your belongings and leave my property. Your employment is terminated effective immediately." "Mother." Rick started forward, but Patricia's raised hand stopped him. "And you," she said, turning her winter-grey gaze on her son, "will marry Francesca Whitmore as planned. The engagement will be announced next week." The words hit Rick like a physical blow. Francesca Whitmore, the vapid socialite whose family fortune would merge nicely with theirs, whose bloodline was impeccable, whose brain was ornamental at best, everything Patricia wanted in a daughter-in-law. "I won't do it," Rick said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will," Patricia replied, with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure that not only does our dear Bliss never work again, but her father's insurance coverage will be mysteriously cancelled. Augustus Morgan will die in agony, and it will be your fault." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Bliss felt the world tilt sideways, her careful plans crumbling like sand castles before the tide. She'd protected her unborn children, but at what cost? Her father's life still hung in the balance, and Patricia held all the cards. "You monster," Rick breathed, his face pale as death. "I'm a realist," Patricia corrected, "and a woman who gets what she wants. Always." She turned to Bliss, her smile as sharp as a blade. "1 hour, dear. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." And then she was gone, gliding from the room like a beautiful nightmare, leaving Bliss and Rick alone with the wreckage of their impossible situation. "I'm sorry," Rick said, his voice broken. "God, Bliss, I'm so sorry. I should have fought harder, should have—" "Don't." Bliss's voice was hollow as a tomb. "Don't apologize for something neither of us could control." He moved toward her, and she saw the desperate need in his eyes. The need to comfort, to fix, to somehow make this right. But there was no making this right. There was only survival. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'll figure it out." She straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "I always do. The money was already transferred to the hospital. My father's treatment started yesterday." She met his eyes directly. At least something good came from this nightmare. Rick's face crumpled. "I wish it could have been different. I wish we could have met some other way under different circumstances." "But we didn't," Bliss said simply. "This is what we got. This is what we have to live with." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Bliss." She looked back, and the expression on his face nearly broke her resolve. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." The promise hung between them like a bridge she could never cross. In another life, another world, she might have run to him, might have let him shelter her from the storm. But not in this life. Not when she carried his children, and he was promised to another woman. "Goodbye, Rick," she said softly. And then she was gone, walking through the mansion one last time, her footsteps echoing in the marble hallways where she'd spent 3 years of her life. Dorothy waited in the servants' quarters with a small suitcase and tears in her eyes. "Child, where will you go?" the older woman asked, pressing an envelope into Bliss's hands. "I've been saving for years. It's not much, but—" "Thank you," Bliss whispered, hugging the woman who had been more mother to her than employer. "For everything." An hour later, Bliss Morgan walked out of the Michaels mansion with nothing but a suitcase, Dorothy's savings, and the growing lives inside her that would change everything. The storm clouds Patricia had unleashed were gathering on the horizon, but Bliss had weathered storms before. She would weather this one too, even if it killed her. Chapter 4. Phoenix Rising. 5 years have a way of turning coal into diamonds, and Bliss Morgan had become something that would have taken Patricia Blackstone Michaels' breath away, if the woman had possessed a soul capable of recognizing true beauty. The Manhattan skyline glittered like a jeweled crown outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office, 30 stories above the city that had once seemed determined to devour her. Morgan Enterprises occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Chrysler Building, its sleek glass and steel interior a testament to what happened when desperation met determination and refused to surrender. Bliss stood behind her mahogany desk, her reflection caught in the window's surface, a woman transformed. Gone was the frightened 23-year-old girl in the maid's uniform, replaced by someone who wore power like a second skin. Her hair was styled in a sleek chignon that framed her face like a crown, her midnight blue suit tailored to perfection, her bearing that of a woman who had learned to command respect rather than beg for it. "Mama, you're going to be late for the Harper interview," came a voice from the doorway, and Bliss turned to see her 5-year-old daughter Savannah standing in the entrance like a miniature vision of elegance. At 5 years old, Savannah Morgan was already showing signs of the breathtaking beauty she would become. Her dark curls framed a face that was pure perfection, but it was her eyes that stopped people cold, those storm-gray eyes that were the exact shade of her father's, filled with an intelligence that seemed far too ancient for her young face. "The interview isn't for another hour, sweetheart," Bliss said, kneeling to her daughter's level and straightening the little girl's navy dress. "And where's your brother?" "Hunter's in the conference room building something with the blocks Brooklyn brought him," Savannah replied, her vocabulary far beyond her years. "He says he's designing a fortress that no one can break into." The words sent a chill through Bliss's heart. Hunter, her beautiful boy, had inherited more than just his father's looks. He'd inherited his protective instincts, his need to build walls against a world that had already shown him it could be cruel. At 5 years old, he was already talking about keeping people safe, about building barriers that couldn't be breached. "Tell him I'll be there in a few minutes," Bliss said, pressing a kiss to Savannah's forehead. "And ask Brooklyn to make sure he doesn't get those blocks stuck in his hair again." Savannah giggled, a sound like silver bells that never failed to make Bliss's heart soar. "I'll tell him, Mama. But you know Hunter. He only listens to you." It was true. Hunter had appointed himself as his mother's protector from the moment he could walk, following her around like a shadow, always positioned between her and the world. The therapist Bliss had consulted said it was normal for children who sensed their parents' vulnerability, but it broke her heart that her son felt the need to guard her at such a young age. "Mrs. Morgan." Brooklyn Sinclair appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand and efficiency radiating from every pore. At 26, Brooklyn had become indispensable to Morgan Enterprises, part assistant, part bodyguard, part fierce protector of the woman who had given her a chance when no one else would. "The car is waiting downstairs for the Harper interview," Brooklyn continued, her voice crisp and professional. I've briefed the security team, and Dashiell has the contracts ready for your review when you return." Bliss nodded, gathering her purse and the files she'd need for the interview. Harper Ravenwood from Business Weekly was known for her tough questions and her ability to dig deeper than most journalists dared. But Bliss had learned to handle difficult questions. She'd been surviving impossible situations for years. "Any word from the investigators?" Bliss asked quietly, her voice dropping so the children couldn't hear. Brooklyn's expression darkened. "They're getting close. The paper trail from the Michaels Foundation leads directly to some very interesting offshore accounts. If what they suspect is true, then we'll have everything we need," Bliss finished. "Good. The more ammunition we have, the better." She had spent 5 years building her empire, but she had also spent 5 years gathering intelligence. Every contact she'd made, every alliance she'd forged, every move she'd made had been calculated to bring her to this moment, the moment when she would have enough power to protect her children and enough evidence to destroy the woman who had tried to destroy her. She had spent 5 years building her empire, but she had also spent 5 years gathering intelligence. Every contact she'd made, every alliance she'd forged, every move she'd made had been calculated to bring her to this moment, the moment when she would have enough power to protect her children and enough evidence to destroy the woman who had tried to destroy her. "Mama, are you fighting the bad lady again?" Hunter's voice came from behind her, and Bliss turned to see her son standing in the doorway, his grey eyes serious beyond his years. Hunter was the mirror image of his father. The same dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead, the same sharp cheekbones, the same storm-grey eyes that seemed to see everything. But where Rick had been broken by his mother's manipulation, Hunter radiated a quiet strength that took Bliss's breath away. "I'm not fighting anyone, sweetheart," Bliss said, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "I'm just working." "Brooklyn says there's a mean lady who wants to hurt us," Hunter said, moving to stand beside his sister with the protective instinct that never failed to amaze Bliss. "She says you're keeping us safe." Bliss shot a warning look at Brooklyn, who had the grace to look sheepish. "We discussed being more careful about what we say in front of the children," Bliss said quietly. "I know, but Hunter asked direct questions, and you said never to lie to them," Brooklyn replied. "He's too smart to fool with fairy tales." It was true. Both children had inherited their father's intelligence along with his looks, and they seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense when the adults around them were being less than honest. Bliss had made the decision early on to be truthful with them, age appropriately, rather than let them imagine threats that were worse than reality. "Come here, both of you," Bliss said, settling into her chair and opening her arms. Hunter and Savannah climbed onto her lap with the easy affection of children who had never doubted their mother's love, and Bliss felt her heart swell with the fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision she'd made for the past 5 years. "There is a woman who doesn't like Mama very much," Bliss said carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had learned that truth was a weapon that could cut both ways. "She's not happy that Mama has built such a successful company, and she might try to cause trouble for us." "Is she the reason we have bodyguards?" Savannah asked, her grey eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. At 5, she was already showing signs of the analytical mind that would serve her well in the business world her mother was building for her. "Partly," Bliss admitted, "but the bodyguards are also there because successful people sometimes attract attention from people who want to hurt them. It's just being careful." "Like wearing seatbelts in the car," Hunter said solemnly, and Bliss smiled at his ability to find practical comparisons for complex situations. "Exactly like wearing seatbelts," she agreed. "Just a precaution to keep us safe." The truth was far more complicated, of course. Patricia Blackstone Michaels had spent the last 5 years trying to destroy everything Bliss had built, using every weapon in her considerable arsenal. There had been lawsuits, attempted hostile takeovers, smear campaigns and threats both subtle and overt. But Bliss had learned to fight fire with fire, and she had built a network of allies who were just as ruthless as Patricia when it came to protecting what they valued. "Are you going to stop her?" Hunter asked, his small hand finding hers with the instinctive need for reassurance that broke her heart. "I'm going to make sure she can never hurt us," Bliss said firmly. "That's a promise." It was a promise she intended to keep. The Harper Ravenwood interview was just the beginning, the first salvo in a war that would end with Patricia's empire in ruins and her children safe from the woman's toxic influence forever. "Mrs. Morgan," Brooklyn said gently, "we really do need to leave for the interview." Bliss kissed both children and set them down, her heart clenching at the way Hunter immediately moved to take Savannah's hand, as if protecting his sister was already second nature to him. "I'll be back in 2 hours," she promised. "Dashiell will be here if you need anything, and Brooklyn has her phone if there's an emergency." "We'll be fine, Mama," Savannah said, with the confidence of a child who had never known a world where she wasn't protected and cherished. "Hunter and I are going to finish our art project for school." "The one about families?" Bliss asked, remembering the assignment that had been causing both children some difficulty. "Yes," Hunter said quietly. "We decided to draw just the 3 of us. Our family." The words hit Bliss like a physical blow. Other children drew pictures of mothers and fathers, grandparents and aunts and uncles. Her children drew pictures of the 3 of them against the world, because that's all they'd ever known. "That sounds perfect," Bliss managed, her voice only slightly unsteady. "I can't wait to see it." As she rode the elevator down to the lobby, Bliss caught her reflection in the polished steel doors and saw not just the successful businesswoman she'd become, but the frightened girl she'd once been. The girl who had traded her body for her father's life, who had lied about her pregnancy to protect her unborn children, who had walked out of the Michaels mansion with nothing but determination and the will to survive. That girl was still there, buried beneath the designer suits and the corporate power, still fighting for the people she loved, still refusing to let the world break her. The lobby of the Chrysler Building was bustling with afternoon activity, executives in expensive suits, tourists craning their necks to admire the Art Deco architecture, business people hurrying to meetings that would determine the fate of millions of dollars. Bliss moved through it all with the fluid grace of someone who belonged in this world, who had earned her place through blood and sacrifice and sheer force of will. "Mrs. Morgan." The voice stopped her cold, and she turned to see a man in his early 40s approaching her, his expensive suit and confident bearing marking him as someone accustomed to power. "Mr. Ashworth," Bliss replied, extending her hand to Weston Ashworth, the CEO of Ashworth Industries and one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," Weston said, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. "I wanted to congratulate you on the Henderson acquisition. Brilliant move." "Thank you," Bliss said, studying his face for any sign of the ulterior motive she'd learned to expect from powerful men. But Weston had always been straightforward in his dealings with her, perhaps because he recognized a kindred spirit in someone who had built an empire from nothing. "Actually, I was hoping we could discuss a potential partnership," Weston continued. "I have a proposition that might interest you." "I'm afraid I'm on my way to an interview," Bliss said, glancing at her watch. "Perhaps we could schedule a meeting for next week." "Of course," Weston said, but something in his expression suggested urgency. "Though I should mention that this involves Patricia Blackstone Michaels." The name sent ice water through Bliss's veins, but she kept her expression neutral. Very few people knew about her history with the Michaels family, and she intended to keep it that way. "Oh?" she said carefully. "Let's just say that I've been watching her recent activities with great interest," Weston said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I think we might have some mutual interests when it comes to limiting her influence." The implication was clear, and Bliss felt a surge of dark satisfaction. She wasn't the only one who had suffered at Patricia's hands, and she wasn't the only one who wanted to see the woman pay for her crimes. "That's a very interesting proposition, Mr. Ashworth," Bliss said, her voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps we should discuss it over dinner sometime soon." "I'll have my assistant call yours," Weston said, handing her his card. "And Mrs. Morgan, good luck with the interview. I have a feeling it's going to be very illuminating." As Bliss walked toward the waiting car, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with the approach of battle. For 5 years, she had been building her strength, gathering her resources, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment was finally here. Patricia Blackstone Michaels had spent 5 years believing she had won, that the frightened girl in the maid's uniform had been broken and forgotten. But she had underestimated the power of a mother's love, the strength that came from having something worth fighting for. Bliss Morgan had risen from the ashes of her former life like a phoenix, and now she was ready to burn down everything Patricia had built. The war was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Collision. Sometimes fate has a sense of humor so twisted that it makes the devil himself applaud, and tonight, at the Metropolitan Museum's annual charity gala, fate was laughing so hard the chandeliers trembled. Bliss stood at the entrance to the Temple of Dendur, the ancient Egyptian monument casting ethereal shadows across the gathering of Manhattan's elite. The museum had been transformed into a glittering wonderland for the evening, with 10,000 white roses and enough diamonds to fund a small country's budget for a year. She wore a gown that had been crafted specifically for this moment, midnight blue silk that flowed like liquid starlight, with a neckline that was elegant rather than provocative, and a back that was cut low enough to show the world she had nothing to hide. "Mrs. Morgan, you look absolutely stunning," Harper Ravenwood approached, with the predatory grace of a journalist who had scented blood in the water. The Business Weekly reporter was impeccably dressed in black, her auburn hair swept into a sophisticated chignon that complemented her sharp green eyes. "Thank you, Harper," Bliss replied, accepting the glass of champagne offered by a passing waiter. "I trust the interview this afternoon gave you everything you needed for your article." "And more," Harper said, her smile sharp as a blade, "though I have to say, your story is even more fascinating than I initially thought. A woman who builds a multi-billion-dollar empire from nothing, who takes on the old money establishment and wins. That's the stuff of legends. Or fairy tales," Bliss said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I've always preferred the Brothers Grimm version to Disney, the original stories have more truth in them." "Speaking of truth," Harper said, leaning closer with the confidential air of someone sharing secrets, "I've been hearing some interesting rumors about your past connection to the Michaels family. Care to comment?" Bliss's grip tightened on her champagne flute, but her expression remained serene. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to. My company has had no business dealings with Michaels Industries." "Of course not," Harper said, though her tone suggested she knew there was more to the story. "Though I find it interesting that Patricia Blackstone Michaels has been so vocal about her opinions regarding your company's rapid expansion." "Mrs. Blackstone Michaels has opinions about many things," Bliss replied coolly. "I try not to take them personally." "How magnanimous of you," Harper said, and Bliss caught the glint of calculation in the reporter's eyes. "Oh, speaking of the Michaels family, I believe I see Richard over by the Egyptian artifacts. Have you two met?" The words hit Bliss like a physical blow, and she turned to follow Harper's gaze across the crowded room. There, standing beside a glass case containing ancient treasures, was Rick Michaels. 5 years had changed him in ways that took her breath away. He was still devastatingly handsome, but there was a hardness to his features that hadn't been there before, a cynicism that spoke of battles fought and lost. His dark hair was shorter now, more controlled, and his expensive tuxedo fit him like armor. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Those storm-grey eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years, now scanning the crowd with the wariness of a man who had learned not to trust the world around him. "We've met," Bliss said quietly, her voice barely audible above the classical music that filled the space. "Really? How interesting," Harper said, her journalist's instincts clearly pinging. "Perhaps you'd like to say hello. I'm sure he'd be delighted to see you." Before Bliss could respond, Harper was already moving across the room, her reporter's instincts driving her toward what she sensed was a story worth pursuing. Bliss followed, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation that made her feel like she was 19 again, about to make the biggest mistake of her life. "Richard, darling," Harper called out as they approached, and Rick turned with the polite smile that Bliss remembered from their first meeting, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "I'd like you to meet Bliss Morgan, the CEO of Morgan Enterprises." Rick's gaze fell on Bliss, and she watched as recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked like pain. His face went pale beneath his tan, and his grip tightened on his whiskey glass until she thought it might shatter. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "it's a pleasure to meet you." "Mr. Michaels," Bliss replied, extending her hand with the same professional courtesy she would show any stranger. "I've heard a great deal about Michaels Industries." When their hands touched, she felt the familiar spark of electricity that had always existed between them, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too. His fingers lingered on hers for just a moment longer than propriety demanded, and she caught the slight tremor in his touch. "I should let you two get reacquainted," Harper said with the satisfied smile of someone who had just connected two very interesting dots. "I need to find the mayor and get his quote on the new downtown development project." And then she was gone, leaving Bliss and Rick alone in a crowd of hundreds, surrounded by ancient artifacts and the ghosts of their shared past. "You look," Rick started, then stopped, his voice catching. "You look incredible." "Thank you," Bliss said, her own voice steadier than she felt. "You look well yourself." "Do I?" Rick's laugh was bitter. "I suppose 5 years of selling my soul to the family business has given me a certain polish." "Is that what you've been doing?" "Among other things," Rick said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I married Francesca, as Mother demanded. We divorced 18 months later when she decided that being a Michaels wife was more work than she'd anticipated. I've been the perfect son and heir, building the empire and playing the part of the eligible bachelor. And has it made you happy?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither dared cross. Rick's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Happiness is a luxury I gave up the right to 5 years ago," he said. "The night I let you walk away." "You didn't let me walk away," Bliss said quietly. "Your mother threw me out, and I didn't fight hard enough to stop her." Rick's voice was rough with regret. "I should have defied her. Should have told the world to go to hell and chosen you instead." "Rick ... Bliss started, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I know," he said. "I know it's too late. I know you've built a life without me, and I have no right to regret the choices I made. But I want you to know that not a day has passed in the last 5 years that I haven't thought about you. Not a day that I haven't wondered what would have happened if I'd been braver." The confession hit Bliss like a physical blow, and she felt her carefully constructed armor beginning to crack. This was dangerous territory, the kind of emotional minefield that could destroy everything she'd built. "We can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stand here and pretend that anything between us could ever be simple." "I know," Rick said, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I had to see you. When I heard you were here tonight, I had to see for myself that you were real, that you were okay." "I'm more than okay," Bliss said, lifting her chin with the pride that had carried her through the darkest moments of the past 5 years. "I'm successful. I'm powerful. I'm everything your mother said I could never be." "You're magnificent," Rick said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're everything I knew you could be, and more." The words hung between them like a confession, and Bliss felt her heart clench with the pain of what could never be. She had loved this man once, in the space of a single night, and part of her had never stopped loving him. But love was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she had children to protect and a war to fight. "I have to go," she said, stepping back from him as if his presence burned her. This was a mistake. "Bliss, wait," Rick said, reaching for her, but she was already moving away, her silk gown flowing around her like liquid courage. "Goodbye, Rick," she said over her shoulder, not trusting herself to look back. But as she walked away, she felt his eyes on her like a physical touch, and she knew that seeing him again had changed everything. The carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart were crumbling, and she was terrified of what might happen if they fell completely. Behind her, Rick watched her go with the same expression of longing and regret that had haunted him for 5 years. He had lost her once through cowardice and circumstance, and now he was losing her again through the choices they'd both made in the aftermath of their destruction. But this time, he wasn't going to let her disappear without a fight. This time, he was going to find a way to be worthy of the woman she'd become, even if it destroyed him in the process. Chapter 6. The Revelation. Secrets have a way of bubbling to the surface like poison in a well, and Harper Ravenwood had just discovered the kind of poison that could destroy empires. The investigative journalist sat in her cramped office at Business Weekly, surrounded by towers of documents, photographs, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption so vast it made her head spin. Empty coffee cups and takeout containers littered her desk, evidence of the 72 hours she'd spent following a paper trail that led straight to the heart of one of Manhattan's most powerful families. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her tired eyes. The photograph in her hand showed a young woman in a maid's uniform, her face partially obscured by shadows, but the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Bliss Morgan, 5 years younger, and a lifetime more vulnerable, standing in the foyer of the Michaels mansion. Harper's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the caller ID before answering. Ravenwood. "Harper, it's Detective Morrison. I've got that information you requested about the Morgan woman's employment history." "Tell me," Harper said, grabbing a pen and preparing to add another piece to the puzzle she'd been assembling. Bliss Morgan worked for the Michaels family for 3 years, from 2019 to 2022. Domestic staff, cleaning and maintenance. Clean record, no complaints, exemplary employee, until her sudden termination in March of 2022. Harper felt her pulse quicken. What was the reason for termination? "That's where it gets interesting," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's no official reason listed. No documentation of misconduct, no performance issues, no explanation whatsoever. She was just gone, like she never existed. And 5 months later, she appears in Chicago with enough capital to start a company that's now worth $2 billion, Harper mused, pieces clicking together in her mind. Where does someone like that get that kind of money? That's what you're the investigative journalist for, isn't it? Morrison chuckled. Though I did find one interesting tidbit. The same week Morgan was terminated, there was a large cash transfer from a private Michaels family account, $40,000, paid to Presbyterian Hospital for the medical treatment of one Augustus Morgan. Harper's blood ran cold. Her father? Bingo. Experimental cancer treatment, full payment in advance. The man made a complete recovery, by the way, still alive and kicking in a nice assisted living facility in Westchester. Jesus, Harper breathed. Morrison, I need you to dig deeper. Find out everything you can about what happened in that house in March 2022. I have a feeling there's a story here that's going to change everything. You got it? But Harper, be careful. The Michaels family has a long reach, and they don't like people digging into their business. After Morrison hung up, Harper stared at the photograph of young Bliss Morgan and felt the familiar thrill of a hunter closing in on her prey. She had started this investigation looking for a puff piece about a successful female entrepreneur, but she had stumbled onto something much bigger, a story of power, corruption, and the kind of secrets that could bring down dynasties. Her computer chimed with an incoming email, and Harper's eyebrows rose when she saw the sender. An anonymous account with the subject line, "The Truth About Bliss Morgan." Inside was a single photograph that made her blood run cold. It showed Bliss Morgan in an elegant black dress, standing in what appeared to be a private room in the Michaels mansion. She was clearly pregnant, her condition obvious despite the flowing lines of the dress. The timestamp on the photo showed it had been taken in July 2022, 4 months after her supposed termination. Harper's hands trembled as she opened the accompanying message. She didn't just work for the Michaels family. She bore them children they've been searching for ever since. If you want the whole story, meet me at the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park at midnight. Come alone. Meanwhile, across town in the Michaels Industries boardroom, Rick sat through yet another mind-numbing meeting about quarterly projections and market expansion, his thoughts consumed by the memory of Bliss's face the night before. The way she'd looked at him with a mixture of longing and fear that had nearly brought him to his knees haunted him like a ghost he couldn't exorcise. "Richard, are you listening?" Patricia's sharp voice cut through his reverie, and he looked up to find his mother's winter-grey eyes boring into him with barely concealed irritation. "Of course," he lied, straightening in his chair. "You were discussing the Henderson acquisition." "We moved past that 20 minutes ago," Patricia said, her voice dripping with disdain. "We're now discussing the Morgan problem." Rick's blood turned to ice. "What Morgan problem?" "The fact that Bliss Morgan is becoming a significant threat to our market share," Patricia said, her tone suggesting that she was discussing an annoying insect rather than a human being. "Her company has been systematically targeting our clients, offering them better deals, better service, better everything. She's bleeding us dry, one contract at a time." "That's called competition, Mother," Rick said, his voice carefully controlled. "It's how business works." "Don't be naive, Richard," Patricia snapped. "This isn't competition. This is personal. That woman has been planning this for years, building her little empire specifically to destroy ours. She's not just a businesswoman, she's a predator, and we're her prey." "You're being paranoid," Rick said, but even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if they were true. The Bliss he'd known 5 years ago had been desperate and vulnerable. But the woman he'd seen last night had been something else entirely, powerful, controlled, and utterly magnificent in her strength. "Am I?" Patricia stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "She's already stolen the Ashworth account, the Henderson merger, and 3 of our biggest pharmaceutical clients. At this rate, she'll have dismantled half our company by Christmas." Maybe she's just better at business than we are, Rick said, and immediately regretted it when he saw the fury that flashed across his mother's face. Better? Patricia's voice was deadly quiet. That little nothing maid thinks she's better than us. She thinks she can waltz into our world and take what belongs to us. She's not a maid anymore, Mother, Rick said, his own anger beginning to rise. She's a CEO. She's built something impressive, and maybe instead of trying to destroy her, we should be asking ourselves how we can do better. Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh, my dear boy, you have no idea what she really is, do you? You think she's some inspiring rags-to-riches story, some plucky little entrepreneur who pulled herself up by her bootstraps? Isn't she? She's a whore, Patricia said, her voice dripping with venom. A whore who spread her legs for my son and then had the audacity to think she could blackmail us for money. Rick shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward. Don't you dare! Don't I dare what? Patricia's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. Tell the truth? She took $40,000 from this family, Richard. $40,000 in exchange for one night in your bed. What would you call that? I'd call it survival, Rick said, his voice shaking with rage. I'd call it a desperate woman doing whatever it took to save her father's life. I'd call it the most selfless act of love I've ever witnessed. How romantic, Patricia sneered, and how utterly naive. Did you ever wonder, Richard, what happened to the child she was carrying when she left here? The words hit Rick like a physical blow, and he felt the world tilt sideways. What child? Oh, you didn't know? Patricia's smile was triumphant. She was pregnant, darling. Pregnant with your child. And she lied about it, took my money, and disappeared into the night with the heir to the Michaels' fortune growing in her belly. Rick's legs gave out, and he sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. That's impossible. The test was negative. The test was forged, Patricia said, moving closer like a predator closing in on wounded prey. She paid off that bleeding heart doctor to give her false results. She played us all for fools. Where is the child now? Rick's voice was barely a whisper. Children, Patricia corrected, her smile widening. Twins, a boy and a girl, 5 years old. Beautiful children who should be here, in this house, learning to take their place in this family. Instead, they're being raised by a woman who stole them from us. Rick felt like he was drowning in quicksand, each revelation pulling him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. You've been watching them? I've been watching her, Patricia said, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what belongs to us. And now that moment has come. What do you mean? I mean that Bliss Morgan has built her little empire on stolen money and false pretenses. I mean that she's been denying our grandchildren their rightful inheritance, and I mean that it's time to correct that injustice. Rick stared at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in his life, not as the strong, protective woman he'd always believed her to be, but as the monster she truly was, a woman who would destroy anyone who stood in her way, including her own son. You're going to try to take them from her, he said, and it wasn't a question. I'm going to succeed in taking them from her, Patricia corrected. They're Michael's, Richard. They belong with us, and I'll do whatever it takes to bring them home. Rick stood slowly, his decision crystallizing like ice in his veins. Number, you won't. I beg your pardon. I said no, Rick repeated, his voice growing stronger with each word. You will not touch those children, you will not go near Bliss, and you will not use the family name or resources to hurt them. Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, my dear boy. You think you have a choice in this matter? You think you can simply tell me no and I'll meekly comply? I think I'm done being your puppet, Rick said, straightening his shoulders. I think I'm done letting you control my life, my choices, my future. And I think it's time for you to learn that some things are more important than money and power. Such as? Love, Rick said simply. Family, the kind of family that's built on truth and trust, not manipulation and fear. Patricia's face went pale with rage. If you choose them over me, you'll lose everything. Your inheritance, your position in the company, your place in this family. You'll be nothing, Richard. Nothing. Maybe, Rick said, moving toward the door, but I'll be free. And for the first time in my life, I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. He paused at the doorway, looking back at the woman who had shaped his entire existence through fear and manipulation. You want to know the truth about Bliss Morgan? He said quietly. She's everything you could never be. She's strong and brave, and she would die before she'd hurt an innocent child. She's the woman I should have chosen 5 years ago, and she's the woman I'm going to choose now. Richard! Patricia's voice cracked like a whip, but he was already walking away, leaving her alone in the boardroom with her fury and her schemes. For the first time in his life, Rick Michaels was going to fight for what mattered, even if it destroyed him in the process. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. War has a way of revealing who people really are beneath their carefully constructed masks, and Bliss Morgan was about to discover just how far a cornered predator would go to protect her territory. The call came at 3:47 a.m., shattering the silence of Bliss's penthouse apartment with the urgency of a fire alarm. She jerked awake, her heart hammering as she reached for her phone, her first thought always of her children's safety. Mrs. Morgan? The voice was professional but tense. Her head of security, Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent who had never called her at home unless it was an emergency. What is it? Bliss asked, already sliding out of bed and moving toward the children's rooms. We have a situation. Someone tried to breach the security system at the children's school. They didn't get in, but they left something behind. A message. Bliss's blood ran cold. What kind of message? The kind that suggests we're dealing with someone who knows exactly who Hunter and Savannah are. Ma'am, I think it's time to activate the emergency protocols. Bliss closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 5 years of careful planning and preparation settling on her shoulders. She had hoped it would never come to this, but she had always known it was a possibility. Do it, she said quietly. And Marcus? Call Weston Ashworth. Tell him it's time. 2 hours later, Bliss sat in her office as the sun rose over Manhattan, her children safely secured in a location that only 3 people in the world knew about. Hunter and Savannah had been whisked away by Brooklyn and a team of bodyguards, their faces solemn with the understanding that this was not a game. The message was simple, Marcus said, sliding a photograph across her desk. It showed pictures of the children at school, at the playground, at the ice cream shop down the street. Someone has been watching them for weeks. Bliss stared at the photos, her heart clenching at the sight of her beautiful children, unaware that they were being stalked by someone who saw them as weapons rather than human beings. And the note? She asked. They belong with their real family, Marcus read from his tablet. Blood calls to blood. You can't keep them from their birthright forever. Patricia, Bliss whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse. That would be my assessment, Marcus agreed. The question is, what do we do about it? Before Bliss could answer, her office door burst open and Rick Michaels strode in like a man possessed. His usual composure was shattered, his hair disheveled, his eyes wild with desperation and rage. Where are they? He demanded, his voice raw with emotion. Where are my children? Bliss stood slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the panic button under her desk. How did you get past security? I told them I was here to warn you, Rick said, his gaze never leaving her face. "Which is exactly what I'm here to do. My mother has lost her mind, Bliss. She's planning to take Hunter and Savannah, and she doesn't care who gets hurt in the process." "I'm aware of the threat," Bliss said coolly, though her heart was pounding at the sight of him. Even in his disheveled state, even with the knowledge that he was part of the family that was trying to destroy her, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. "Are you?" Rick moved closer, his grey eyes blazing with an intensity that took her breath away. "Do you know that she's hired private investigators to follow you? That she's been building a legal case to claim custody of the children? That she's willing to destroy your company, your reputation, your entire life to get what she wants?" "Marcus," Bliss said quietly, never taking her eyes off Rick. "Give us the room." "Mom, I don't think—" "Give us the room," Bliss repeated, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command respect. "And close the door behind you." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then nodded and left, his hand resting on the weapon at his side as he passed Rick. The door closed with a soft click, leaving them alone in the space that had become Bliss's fortress against the world. "You knew," Rick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew about the twins. You knew they were mine." "Yes," Bliss said simply, seeing no point in denying what was written in every line of their children's faces. "I knew. And you said nothing. For 5 years, you let me believe—" "I let you believe what you needed to believe," Bliss interrupted, her voice sharp with old pain. "I let you believe that your mother had won, that her cruelty had succeeded, that the night we spent together had meant nothing." "It meant everything," Rick said, his voice breaking. "It meant everything to me." "Did it?" Bliss moved around her desk, her silk blouse and tailored skirt making her look like a warrior queen preparing for battle. "Because from where I stood, it looked like you chose her over me. It looked like you chose your inheritance and your position and your comfortable life over fighting for what we might have had." "I was a coward," Rick said, his admission hanging in the air between them like a confession. "I was weak and scared, and I let her manipulate me into believing that I had no choice. But I'm not that man anymore, Bliss. I'm not going to let her hurt you or our children." "Our children," Bliss repeated, tasting the words like wine. "You don't get to call them that. You don't get to walk into my life after 5 years and claim them like they're possessions you forgot to pick up." "They're my blood," Rick said, his voice rising with desperation. "They're part of me." "They're part of me too," Bliss shot back, her own anger finally breaking free. "I'm the one who carried them for 9 months while hiding from your mother's lawyers. I'm the one who gave birth to them alone in a hospital room because I was too terrified to tell anyone who the father was. I'm the one who's raised them and loved them and protected them from the world that would see them as nothing more than pawns in your family's twisted games." "I didn't know," Rick said, his voice breaking. "God, Bliss, I didn't know. If I had known—" "You would have what?" Bliss's voice was sharp as a blade. "Defied your mother. Chosen love over money. Fought for something that mattered more than your precious inheritance." "Yes," Rick said, his voice raw with conviction. "Yes, I would have done all of that and more. I would have burned down the entire Michaels empire if it meant keeping you and our children safe." "Pretty words," Bliss said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "But words don't erase 5 years of silence. Words don't erase the nights I spent wondering if you ever thought about me, if you ever regretted what happened between us." "I thought about you every day," Rick said, moving closer until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. "I regretted every choice I made that led to losing you. I regretted not being brave enough to fight for you when it mattered." "And now," Bliss asked, her voice barely a whisper, "now that you know about Hunter and Savannah, now that you know what your mother is planning, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to stop her," Rick said, his voice filled with the determination that took her breath away. I'm going to protect our children and I'm going to make sure she never hurts you again." "How?" Bliss asked. "She's Patricia Blackstone Michaels. She has unlimited resources, unlimited connections, unlimited power. What can you possibly do against that?" "I can tell the truth," Rick said simply. "I can expose her for what she really is. I can take away her weapons by making sure everyone knows exactly what she's capable of." "And destroy yourself in the process?" "If that's what it takes," Rick said, his grey eyes blazing with conviction. "If that's what it takes to keep our family safe." The word family hung in the air between them like a promise, and Bliss felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. This was the man she had fallen in love with in the space of a single night, not the broken, manipulated boy who had let his mother control his life, but the strong, determined man who was willing to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. "Rick," she said, her voice soft with a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. "I can't do this again. I can't let myself care about you only to watch you choose her over me." "Then don't," Rick said, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. "Don't let yourself care about me, but let me care about you. Let me fight for you and our children. Let me be the man I should have been 5 years ago." Before Bliss could respond, the door to her office burst open again, and Patricia Blackstone Michaels swept in like an avenging angel, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer suit immaculate despite the early hour. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "The whore and the fool, playing house while the real world burns around them." "Mother," Rick said, his voice deadly quiet as he stepped protectively in front of Bliss, "you're not welcome here." "I'm not welcome." Patricia's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "I'm not welcome in the office of the woman who stole my grandchildren and corrupted my son. How presumptuous of you to think you can dictate where I go and what I do." "Get out," Bliss said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command respect. "This is my building, my office, my territory. You have no power here." "Don't I?" Patricia's smile was sharp as a blade. "Let me tell you about power, my dear. Power is having the resources to destroy someone's life with a single phone call. Power is having the connections to make sure that someone never works again, never finds peace, never escapes the consequences of their actions." "Are you threatening me?" Bliss asked, stepping around Rick to face Patricia directly. "I'm educating you," Patricia said, her winter-gray eyes glittering with malice. "You see, I've spent the last 5 years gathering information about you, about your business practices, your financial dealings, your personal life. I know about the shortcuts you took to build your empire, the corners you cut, the people you stepped on to get where you are." "You know nothing about me," Bliss said, her voice steady despite the ice water running through her veins. "I know that you're a fraud," Patricia said, moving closer like a predator closing in on wounded prey. "I know that you built your company on stolen money and false pretenses. I know that you've been lying to everyone, including yourself, about what you really are." "And what am I?" Bliss asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "A common whore who got lucky," Patricia said, her voice dripping with venom. "A woman who spread her legs for my son and then had the audacity to think she could take what belonged to my family." The words hit Bliss like physical blows, each one designed to cut as deeply as possible. But instead of breaking her, they only made her stronger, reminding her of exactly who she was dealing with and why she had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. "You're right about one thing," Bliss said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I am a woman who took what belonged to your family, but not in the way you think." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I took your son's heart," Bliss said, her eyes never leaving Patricia's face. "I took his love, his loyalty, his future. and now I'm going to take everything else. You can't touch us, Patricia said, but for the first time there was uncertainty in her voice. We're the Michaels family. We're untouchable. Am I? Bliss moved to her desk and picked up a thick file folder, holding it up like a weapon. 5 years of investigation, Patricia. 5 years of following every lead, tracking every transaction, documenting every crime. You want to play games with my children? Let's play. You wouldn't dare, Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. I would dare anything to protect my family, Bliss said, her voice filled with the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. I would burn down the entire world if it meant keeping Hunter and Savannah safe. They're not your children, Patricia said, her voice rising with desperation. They're Michael's. They belong with us. They belong with their mother, Rick said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. They belong with the woman who loves them more than power, more than money, more than anything else in this world. You can't choose her over your family, Patricia said, turning to her son with the desperate plea of someone who felt control slipping away. You can't choose her over everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to give you. I'm not choosing her over family, Rick said, his voice steady with conviction. I'm choosing my real family, the family I should have chosen 5 years ago. If you walk away from me now, you'll have nothing, Patricia said, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. Nothing but a woman who will never truly love you and children who will grow up to hate you for what you've cost them. Maybe, Rick said, moving to stand beside Bliss, his hand finding hers. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. At least I'll be able to sleep at night knowing that I chose love over fear, truth over lies, family over money. Patricia stared at them for a long moment, her face twisted with a rage that was both beautiful and terrible. Then her expression smoothed into the cold, calculating mask that had served her so well for so many years. This isn't over, she said, her voice deadly quiet. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started. I will destroy you, both of you. I will take those children, and I will make sure you never see them again. Try, Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this war for 5 years. I've been waiting for you to make your move. Now let's see what you're really made of. Patricia turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to Armageddon. At the threshold, she paused and looked back, her winter-grey eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. You have no idea what you've just unleashed, she said, and then she was gone, leaving Rick and Bliss alone in the silence that followed the storm. Are you ready for this? Rick asked, his voice quiet with the weight of what they were about to face. I've been ready for 5 years, Bliss said, her hand tightening on his. The question is, are you ready to fight for us? Really fight, no matter what it costs. I'm ready, Rick said, his voice filled with a conviction that took her breath away. I'm ready to fight for you, for our children, for the family we should have been all along. Then let's go to war, Bliss said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle for their family had begun. Bliss moved to her desk and picked up a thick file folder, holding it up like a weapon. 5 years of investigation, Patricia. 5 years of following every lead, tracking every transaction, documenting every crime. You want to play games with my children? Let's play. You wouldn't dare, Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. I would dare anything to protect my family, Bliss said, her voice filled with the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. I would burn down the entire world if it meant keeping Hunter and Savannah safe. They're not your children, Patricia said, her voice rising with desperation. They're Michael's. They belong with us. They belong with their mother. Rick said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. They belong with the woman who loves them more than power, more than money, more than anything else in this world. You can't choose her over your family, Patricia said, turning to her son with the desperate plea of someone who felt control slipping away. You can't choose her over everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to give you. I'm not choosing her over family, Rick said, his voice steady with conviction. I'm choosing my real family, the family I should have chosen 5 years ago. If you walk away from me now, you'll have nothing, Patricia said, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. Nothing but a woman who will never truly love you and children who will grow up to hate you for what you've cost them. Maybe, Rick said, moving to stand beside Bliss, his hand finding hers. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. At least I'll be able to sleep at night knowing that I chose love over fear, truth over lies, family over money. Patricia stared at them for a long moment, her face twisted with a rage that was both beautiful and terrible. Then her expression smoothed into the cold, calculating mask that had served her so well for so many years. "This isn't over," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started. I will destroy you, both of you. I will take those children, and I will make sure you never see them again." "Try," Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this war for 5 years. "I've been waiting for you to make your move. Now let's see what you're really made of." Patricia turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to Armageddon. At the threshold she paused and looked back, her winter-grey eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," she said. And then she was gone, leaving Rick and Bliss alone in the silence that followed the storm. "Are you ready for this?" Rick asked, his voice quiet with the weight of what they were about to face. "I've been ready for 5 years," Bliss said, her hand tightening on his. "The question is, are you ready to fight for us? Really fight, no matter what it costs?" "I'm ready," Rick said, his voice filled with a conviction that took her breath away. "I'm ready to fight for you, for our children, for the family we should have been all along." "Then let's go to war," Bliss said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle for their family had begun. Bliss moved to her desk and picked up a thick file folder, holding it up like a weapon. 5 years of investigation, Patricia. 5 years of following every lead, tracking every transaction, documenting every crime. You want to play games with my children? Let's play." "You wouldn't dare," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I would dare anything to protect my family," Bliss said, her voice filled with the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I would burn down the entire world if it meant keeping Hunter and Savannah safe." "They're not your children," Patricia said, her voice rising with desperation. "They're Michael's. They belong with us." "They belong with their mother," Rick said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "They belong with the woman who loves them more than power, more than money, more than anything else in this world." "You can't choose her over your family," Patricia said, turning to her son with the desperate plea of someone who felt control slipping away. "You can't choose her over everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to give you." "I'm not choosing her over family," Rick said, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm choosing my real family, the family I should have chosen 5 years ago." "If you walk away from me now, you'll have nothing," Patricia said, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. "Nothing but a woman who will never truly love you and children who will grow up to hate you for what you've cost them." "Maybe," Rick said, moving to stand beside Bliss, his hand finding hers. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. At least I'll be able to sleep at night, knowing that I chose love over fear, truth over lies, family over money. Patricia stared at them for a long moment, her face twisted with a rage that was both beautiful and terrible. Then her expression smoothed into the cold, calculating mask that had served her so well for so many years. "This isn't over," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started. I will destroy you, both of you. I will take those children, and I will make sure you never see them again." "Try," Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this war for 5 years. "I've been waiting for you to make your move. Now let's see what you're really made of." Patricia turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to Armageddon. At the threshold, she paused and looked back, her winter-grey eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," she said. And then she was gone, leaving Rick and Bliss alone in the silence that followed the storm. "Are you ready for this?" Rick asked, his voice quiet with the weight of what they were about to face. "I've been ready for 5 years," Bliss said, her hand tightening on his. "The question is, are you ready to fight for us? Really fight, no matter what it costs?" "I'm ready," Rick said, his voice filled with a conviction that took her breath away. "I'm ready to fight for you, for our children, for the family we should have been all along." "Then let's go to war," Bliss said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle for their family had begun. Bliss moved to her desk and picked up a thick file folder, holding it up like a weapon. 5 years of investigation, Patricia. 5 years of following every lead, tracking every transaction, documenting every crime. You want to play games with my children? Let's play. "You wouldn't dare," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I would dare anything to protect my family," Bliss said, her voice filled with the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. "I would burn down the entire world if it meant keeping Hunter and Savannah safe." "They're not your children," Patricia said, her voice rising with desperation. "They're Michael's. They belong with us." "They belong with their mother," Rick said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "They belong with the woman who loves them more than power, more than money, more than anything else in this world." "You can't choose her over your family," Patricia said, turning to her son with the desperate plea of someone who felt control slipping away. "You can't choose her over everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to give you." "I'm not choosing her over family," Rick said, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm choosing my real family. The family I should have chosen 5 years ago. If you walk away from me now, you'll have nothing," Patricia said, her voice cracking with rage and desperation. "Nothing but a woman who will never truly love you, and children who will grow up to hate you for what you've cost them." "Maybe," Rick said, moving to stand beside Bliss, his hand finding hers. "But at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. At least I'll be able to sleep at night knowing that I chose love over fear, truth over lies, family over money." Patricia stared at them for a long moment, her face twisted with a rage that was both beautiful and terrible. Then her expression smoothed into the cold, calculating mask that had served her so well for so many years. "This isn't over," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just started. I will destroy you, both of you. I will take those children, and I will make sure you never see them again." "Try," Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this war for 5 years. "I've been waiting for you to make your move. Now let's see what you're really made of." Patricia turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to Armageddon. At the threshold, she paused and looked back, her winter-grey eyes burning with the promise of vengeance. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," she said. And then she was gone, leaving Rick and Bliss alone in the silence that followed the storm. "Are you ready for this?" Rick asked, his voice quiet with the weight of what they were about to face. "I've been ready for 5 years," Bliss said, her hand tightening on his. "The question is, are you ready to fight for us? Really fight, no matter what it costs?" "I'm ready," Rick said, his voice filled with a conviction that took her breath away. "I'm ready to fight for you, for our children, for the family we should have been all along." "Then let's go to war," Bliss said, her voice carrying the deadly calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle for their family had begun. Chapter 8. The Reckoning Begins. Love and war danced together like fire and gasoline, and Bliss Morgan was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous battles are fought in the space between heartbeats. The emergency meeting took place in the penthouse suite of the Ashworth Industries building, 30 floors above the city that had become their battlefield. Weston Ashworth stood at the head of the polished conference table, his silver hair catching the late morning light as he surveyed the assembled team like a general preparing for war. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. "We are here to discuss the systematic destruction of Patricia Blackstone Michaels and everything she represents." Bliss sat at his right hand, her midnight blue suit a stark contrast to the warm wood of the conference room. She had spent the morning securing her children in a location that even she didn't know the exact coordinates of, a precaution that had torn her heart in two but was absolutely necessary for their safety. "The evidence we've gathered is substantial," continued Dr. Hadrian Westbrook, the distinguished physician who had helped Bliss 5 years ago and had been quietly documenting Patricia's crimes ever since. "Tax evasion, money laundering, bribery, extortion, the list is comprehensive." "And the media strategy?" Bliss asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "Harper Ravenwood has agreed to break the story," Weston said, his smile sharp as a blade. "She's been investigating the Michaels family for months, and she's uncovered some truly damaging information. When combined with what we're providing, it should be enough to bring down the entire organization." "What about the children?" Rick asked, his voice tight with concern. He had barely slept since the confrontation with his mother, his mind consumed with worry for Hunter and Savannah and the woman who had risked everything to protect them. "They're safe," Bliss said, though the words felt hollow without her babies beside her. "But Patricia won't give up easily. She'll fight with everything she has." "Let her fight," Weston said, his eyes glittering with the anticipation of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. "We're ready for her." The door to the conference room opened, and Brooklyn Sinclair entered with the purposeful stride of someone bearing urgent news. "Mrs. Morgan, we have a problem. Patricia Blackstone Michaels just called a press conference. She's claiming that you kidnapped her grandchildren." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Bliss felt her blood turn to ice as she processed the implications of Patricia's move. It was brilliant in its simplicity. By positioning herself as the victim, Patricia could control the narrative and make Bliss look like the villain. "When?" Bliss asked, her voice deadly calm. "In 1 hour," Brooklyn said. "She's assembled a team of lawyers, child psychologists, and family advocates. She's claiming that you've been keeping the children from their rightful family, that you've been poisoning them against their father and grandmother." "Clever," Weston said, his voice filled with grudging admiration. "Evil, but clever. She's trying to get ahead of our story by making herself the sympathetic party. What do we do? Rick asked, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. We fight back, Bliss said, her voice growing stronger with each word. We tell the truth, all of it, no matter how painful, no matter how damaging to any of us. Bliss, Rick said, his voice soft with concern. If we do this, there's no going back. Your privacy, your past, everything will be public knowledge. I know, Bliss said, meeting his gaze directly. But I'd rather have the world know the truth than let your mother destroy our children with her lies. Our children, Rick repeated, and she could hear the wonder in his voice, as if he was still trying to believe that they were real. Yes, Bliss said, her voice softening. Our children, Hunter and Savannah, they deserve better than to be pawns in this game. Then we end the game, Weston said, his voice filled with finality. We tell the world exactly what Patricia Blackstone Michaels is capable of, and we let them draw their own conclusions. 2 hours later, Bliss stood on the steps of the New York Supreme Court building, flanked by a team of lawyers and surrounded by reporters hungry for blood. The press conference Patricia had called had been a masterpiece of manipulation, tears, righteous indignation, and claims of a grandmother's love being denied by a vindictive woman. Now it was Bliss's turn to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and cameras. I stand before you today not as a CEO or a businesswoman, but as a mother who has spent 5 years protecting her children from a woman who sees them as possessions rather than human beings. The crowd stirred, sensing that this was more than just a typical custody dispute. 5 years ago, I was a maid in the Michaels household, Bliss continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I was desperate, facing my father's death from cancer, with no money for the treatment that could save his life. Patricia Blackstone Michaels offered me a deal, $40,000 in exchange for one night with her son. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Bliss saw the reporter's eyes light up with the recognition of a story that would dominate headlines for months. I want to be clear, Bliss said, her voice cutting through the noise. I was not coerced into this arrangement. I made a choice, a desperate choice, but a choice nonetheless. I chose to sacrifice my dignity, my self-respect, and my innocence to save my father's life. And did you? Called out a reporter from the back of the crowd. Yes, Bliss said, her voice strong and clear. The treatment was successful. My father is alive today because of the choice I made. But that choice had consequences I never anticipated. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the crowd. I became pregnant, she continued. When I told Patricia Blackstone Michaels about the pregnancy, she made it clear that she intended to take my child and discard me like garbage. So I did what any mother would do. I protected my baby. I lied about the pregnancy test and disappeared before she could steal my children. Children! Another reporter called out. Twins, Bliss said, her voice softening with love. Hunter and Savannah. Beautiful, intelligent, loving children who have been the center of my world for 5 years. Children who Patricia Blackstone Michaels now claims belong to her simply because they share her blood. What do you say to her claims that you've been keeping them from their father? Asked Harper Ravenwood, who had positioned herself prominently in the crowd. I say that blood doesn't make a family, Bliss replied. Love makes a family. Care makes a family. Being there for someone through good times and bad, that's what makes a family. Richard Michaels may be their biological father, but he has never been their daddy. He has never tucked them into bed, never kissed their scraped knees, never held them when they had nightmares. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. But I also want to say that Richard Michaels is not the villain in this story, Bliss continued, her voice filled with a compassion that surprised even herself. He is as much a victim of his mother's manipulation as I was. He was raised to believe that family meant control, that love meant ownership, that power was more important than people. And now, called out another reporter, now he's learning what real family means, Bliss said, her eyes finding Rick in the crowd. He's learning that love isn't about possession. It's about protection. It's about choosing to fight for someone even when it costs you everything. Are you saying that you and Richard Michaels are together? Harper asked, her journalist's instincts sensing the heart of the story. I'm saying that we're both committed to doing whatever it takes to protect our children from a woman who would use them as weapons in her war against anyone who dares to defy her, Bliss said. Whether that means we're together or apart, whether it means we have everything or nothing, our children's safety and happiness come first. What evidence do you have to support these claims against Patricia Blackstone Michaels? Called out a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. I have 5 years of documentation, Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment. Financial records, recorded conversations, witness statements, and most importantly, the testimony of the man who knows her better than anyone else. Rick stepped forward, his face pale but determined. I am Richard Michaels, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. Patricia Blackstone Michaels is my mother, and everything that Bliss Morgan has said is true. The crowd erupted in questions and camera flashes, but Rick continued speaking, his voice rising above the chaos. My mother forced me to participate in her scheme to buy an heir, he said. She threatened to destroy Bliss's life if I didn't comply. She has spent 5 years trying to locate and claim children she had no hand in raising. She has used illegal methods, hired private investigators, and threatened innocent people in her quest to control what she believes belongs to her. Why are you speaking out now? Harper asked. Because I'm tired of being a coward, Rick said, his voice breaking with emotion. Because I've spent 5 years letting fear control my life, and I refuse to let my children grow up in the shadow of that fear, because Bliss Morgan is the strongest, most courageous woman I've ever known, and she deserves better than to fight this battle alone. Are you in love with her? A reporter called out. Rick's eyes found Bliss across the crowd, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade away. I've been in love with her for 5 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of a confession. From the moment I first saw her, I knew she was special. She was kind and brave and beautiful, and she deserved so much better than what my family put her through. And now, Harper pressed, now I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of her, Rick said, his voice filled with conviction. I'm going to fight for her. For our children, for the family we should have been all along. The press conference continued for another hour with questions and answers that would dominate the news cycle for weeks. But for Bliss, the most important moment had already passed, the moment when Rick had chosen to stand beside her, to fight for their family, to risk everything for love. As they walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by lawyers and bodyguards, Bliss felt Rick's hand find hers. Are you ready for what comes next? He asked quietly. I'm ready for anything, Bliss said, her voice filled with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived the worst that life could throw at her. As long as we're together. Of course, Rick said, respect evident in his voice. Your mama is very wise. She'll make the right decision. We'll be right outside, Savannah said, taking her brother's hand. Come on, Hunter, let's go find more butterflies. As the children ran back outside, Bliss felt the weight of their expectations settling on her shoulders. They were too young to understand the full complexity of the situation, but they were old enough to sense that their future depended on the choices she made. They're incredible, Rick said, his voice filled with awe. They're so smart, so mature for their age. They've had to be, Bliss said, her voice tinged with sadness. They've never known a world where they didn't have to be careful, where they didn't have to think about safety and security. That's going to change, Rick said, his voice filled with determination. I'm going to make sure they have the childhood they deserve. Are you? Bliss asked, turning to face him fully. Because this isn't a game, Rick. This isn't something you can fix with money or good intentions. Your mother is going to come after us with everything she has. I know, Rick said, his voice steady, and I'm ready for that fight. Are you ready to lose everything? Bliss asked, her voice challenging. Your inheritance, your position, your place in society? Are you ready to have nothing but us? I already have nothing without you, Rick said, his voice filled with pain. The last 5 years have been empty, meaningless. I've been going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. And if I can't forgive you? Bliss asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If I can't get past what happened, what you let happen, then I'll still fight for our children, Rick said, his voice unwavering. I'll still protect you and them from my mother. I'll still make sure you have everything you need to be happy and safe. Even if it means you're not part of that happiness. Even then, Rick said, his voice breaking. Because loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even if it's not what you want for yourself. Bliss stared at him, seeing the man he had become. Not the broken boy who had let fear control his life, but the strong, selfless man who was willing to sacrifice everything for the people he loved. I'm scared, she whispered, the admission torn from her throat. Of what? Rick asked, moving closer but not touching her, respecting the boundaries she had built around herself. Of believing in us again? Bliss said, her voice thick with tears. Of letting myself hope that we could be a real family. Of trusting that you won't run when things get difficult. I'm not running, Rick said, his voice filled with conviction. I'm not the same man I was 5 years ago, Bliss. I've learned what it means to lose everything that matters. I've learned what it costs to be a coward. Have you? Bliss asked, searching his face for any sign of the weakness that had destroyed them before. I've learned that some things are worth fighting for, Rick said, his voice growing stronger. That love is worth more than money, that family is worth more than power, that being true to yourself is worth more than being accepted by people who don't really know you. What is it? Rick asked, seeing her face go pale. Your mother, Bliss said, her voice hollow. She's filed an emergency custody petition. She's claiming that I'm an unfit mother, that I've kidnapped the children, that I'm psychologically unstable. She can't do that, Rick said, his voice filled with fury. She has no legal standing. She has lawyers, Bliss interrupted, her voice growing stronger with each word. She has money, influence, connections. She's claiming that as their biological grandmother, she has rights that supersede mine. And she's winning, Bliss said, her voice breaking. The judge has issued a temporary order requiring me to surrender Hunter and Savannah to her custody within 24 hours. The words hit Rick like a physical blow. He sank into the nearest chair, his face pale with shock and rage. No, he said, his voice deadly quiet. No, I won't let her do this. I won't let her take them. How are you going to stop her? Bliss asked, her voice filled with desperation. She's using the system against us. She's turned our love for those children into a weapon. Then we'll have to fight with weapons of our own, Rick said, his voice growing stronger. We'll have to show the world who she really is. Rick, Bliss said, her voice soft with vulnerability, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll protect them. Even if it means choosing them over me, even if it means walking away from everything you've ever known, promise me you'll keep them safe. I promise, Rick said, his voice filled with conviction, but I'm not choosing them over you. I'm choosing all of you. I'm choosing our family. Our family, Bliss repeated, and for the first time in 5 years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win this war. Our family, Rick confirmed, taking her hands in his, and we're going to fight for it with everything we have. Outside, Hunter and Savannah played in the garden, their laughter a reminder of what they were fighting for. Inside, their parents prepared for the battle of their lives, a battle that would determine not just their future but the future of love itself. The war was far from over, but for the first time, they were fighting it together. Chapter 10. The Beautiful Revenge. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't knock politely on the door. It kicks it down with the fury of a woman who has waited 5 years to reclaim her children and destroy the monster who tried to steal them. The Manhattan family court was packed to capacity, with reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers filling every available seat. The custody hearing had become the most watched legal proceeding of the year, with news crews broadcasting live from the courthouse steps. Patricia Blackstone Michaels sat at the plaintiff's table like a queen holding court, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer suit impeccable despite the early hour. She had assembled a team of the city's most expensive lawyers, child psychologists, and family advocates, all prepared to testify that she was the loving grandmother fighting to save her grandchildren from an unstable mother. Across the aisle, Bliss Morgan sat with quiet dignity, her midnight blue suit elegant but understated, her bearing that of a woman who had nothing to hide. Her legal team was smaller, but no less formidable, led by Catherine Thornfield, the most feared family attorney in the state. "Your Honor," Patricia's lead attorney began, "we are here today to address a grave injustice. My client, Patricia Blackstone Michaels, has been denied access to her biological grandchildren for 5 years by a woman who obtained custody through fraud and deception." "Objection," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "There was no fraud or deception. Ms. Morgan is the biological mother of these children." "Sustained," Judge Harrison ruled. "Counsel will stick to the facts." For the next 2 hours, Patricia's attorney painted a picture of Bliss as an unfit mother, a woman who had kidnapped her own children, who had denied them access to their father and grandmother, who had built her fortune on stolen money. "My client only wants what's best for Hunter and Savannah," he concluded. "She wants them to know their heritage, their family, their rightful place in the world." "Ms. Thornfield," Judge Harrison said, "you may present your case." Catherine stood with the fluid grace of a predator about to strike. "Your Honor, this case is not about custody. This case is about power, control, and the lengths to which one woman will go to possess what she believes belongs to her." Patricia Blackstone Michaels didn't want to be a grandmother to Hunter and Savannah, Catherine continued. She wanted to own them. She wanted to control them. She wanted to use them as pawns in her ongoing war against anyone who dared to defy her authority. "Objection," Patricia's attorney called out. "Counsel is making inflammatory statements without evidence." "I have evidence," Catherine said, her smile sharp as a blade. 5 years' worth of evidence. Phone records, financial documents, recorded conversations, and most importantly, the testimony of someone who knows Patricia Blackstone Michaels better than anyone else. The courtroom stirred with anticipation as Catherine gestured toward the back of the room. "Your Honor, I call Richard Michaels to the stand." The murmur that rippled through the courtroom was electric. Rick stood slowly, his face pale but determined, and walked to the witness stand. "Mr. Michaels," Catherine began after he had been sworn in, "what is your relationship to the defendant?" "She's my mother," Rick said, his voice clear and strong. "And what is your relationship to the plaintiff, Bliss Morgan?" "She's the mother of my children," Rick said, his eyes finding Bliss across the courtroom. She's the woman I love. She's the woman I should have protected 5 years ago." "Tell us about 5 years ago," Catherine said. For the next hour, Rick laid bare the truth of what had happened in the Michaels mansion. He spoke of his mother's manipulation, her threats, her callous disregard for human dignity. "She threatened to destroy Bliss's life if I didn't comply," Rick said, his voice breaking. "She said she would make sure her father died in agony, that she would ruin her reputation, that she would make it impossible for her to survive." "And what happened when Ms. Morgan became pregnant?" "My mother saw it as a victory," Rick said. "She immediately began making plans to take the children away from Bliss. She talked about raising them as proper Michaels heirs, about molding them into the next generation of the family empire." "What did you do?" "Nothing," Rick said, the word falling from his lips like a confession. "I did nothing. I was a coward." "And now?" Catherine asked. "Now I'm fighting," Rick said, his voice filled with conviction. "Now I'm choosing my real family over the woman who gave birth to me, but never learned how to love." "Your Honor," Catherine said, turning to address the judge, "we have documented evidence of Patricia Blackstone Michaels' attempts to manipulate the legal system, her illegal surveillance of the children, her threats against Ms. Morgan." She gestured to Brooklyn,